everyone. Welcome to Risk Roundup. Over the years, the world has become very integrated. And as a result, everyone and everything has become interconnected and interdependent in numerous ways. Now, while the integration has been a move to drive towards efficiency and affordability, the increased consolidation of production in countries like China, Taiwan, Vietnam, India, and more, where the labor cost is low, has brought the global community many complex challenges. For instance, with the pandemic starting in China and their economy shutting down, the resulting fallout, shortages, and collapse of supply chains has cautioned us about the risk of global dependency on any single country and the need for distributing risk. To discuss the COVID-19 impact on the global supply chain, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Dr. Zal Phiroz to Risk Roundup. Dr. Phiroz holds executive and senior management roles, including appointments at Procter & Gamble, Fortune 500 companies, and has held faculty appointments at Harvard University, University of Southern California, Michigan State University, and University of California, San Diego. He is a senior partner at Pier Consulting Group, and author of the upcoming book, Perspectives of Supply Chain Competitiveness, and he's based in the United States. Welcome, Dr. Phiroz. We are honored to have you on Risk Roundup.
Hi, Jayshree. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you having me here today.
Oh, wonderful. No, delighted to have you, to welcome you here on Risk Roundup. So let's first begin talking about the supply chain, because as we compare it to the last pandemic and to the current pandemic, because as we compare how the global economy was during the last pandemic, that was the time of, I think, Spanish flu, to this COVID-19 pandemic era, what do you think has changed with respect to the supply chains?
A lot has changed. So if we look back, in the Spanish flu, we can see that supply chains existed. Supply chains have existed throughout, any time that there's ever been commerce. But if we look at a previous generation in the Spanish flu era, there was perhaps not as much globalization as there is now. So now we have manufacturers in one country, distributors in another country, wholesalers throughout the world, retailers throughout the world, online commerce, all sorts of ways of doing business that essentially just didn't exist back in the Spanish flu era. What that means is that business is done differently, and the impact to global business is perhaps far more now than it was before. In a previous generation in which there may have been a pandemic like the Spanish flu, I don't know the exact data and the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I would guess that the number of imports and exports were significantly less.
Yes, that is very true. You made an excellent point about the globalization, the nature and the impact of the globalization, because as we see China, that during the Spanish flu time, it held a very little percentage of the global economy. The impact of China was very minor. But now if we look at it, China of significant, I won't say majority, but significant stake in the global economy. And because the origin of this pandemic virus was in China, is in China, now currently China, as we all know, is the de facto factory of the world. Everybody, depends on China for the manufacturing. So do you think this reality has drawn attention to the damage such dependency on one country can bring from an economic perspective, as we see a significant percentage of supply chains reeling in shock and crumbling with each passing day because of this, ongoing COVID-19 pandemic?
Absolutely. China, you're absolutely right, the backbone of manufacturing. But from a supply chain perspective, that's just one cog of the entire dynamic. And the reason for why I say that is because over the past 6 weeks, people in general have changed their behavioral patterns. A large majority of people have now had to change the way they've functioned. The number of retail outlets that have closed or have temporarily paused, or the ways businesses have changed from curbside delivery to digital fulfillment and online ordering has changed the dynamic of how people actually purchase. What products people purchase in general have also changed. the number of regulations and the spikes in demand for certain products that you would never have thought about, like toilet paper and hand sanitizer and so have changed the dynamic of how commerce has kind of operated. And it's taken place in the last 5 or 6 weeks. The reason for why this is important is because in a supply chain disaster scenario, which we've experienced in many scenarios in the past, from hurricanes taking out manufacturing sites or distribution centers or portions of a supply chain, or the 9/11 attacks, which heightened security measures because of terrorism, and various floods that took place in Thailand, and earthquakes in Japan, all sorts of things that have impacted specific industries, specific geographies, have impacted particular groups of supply chains, can come into focus. Perhaps the difference here is that this pandemic is much more global. It affects all geographies. Every single country has been affected and impacted in some way, shape, or form. It affects every single person for the most part in terms of how people are actually behaving and what they're allowed to do. Job loss, employment numbers, purchasing behavioral patterns, all of these types of things. And it affects businesses throughout the board in terms of how business can actually operate. There's some businesses that have done more business in COVID-19, companies like hand soap manufacturers or PPE manufacturers. But the majority of businesses are in a time of flux, of uncertainty, and many have done worse. So while China may be the epicenter, may be the root cause of the problems that have taken place, or the starting points for the coronavirus and for COVID-19, I would hesitate to say, I wouldn't say that they are, that because they are affected, everyone else is affected. I would say that they are just one piece of the puzzle. So when you change behavioral patterns of consumers, when you have the inability to forecast and project demand, when you don't necessarily know whether products are still going to be viable, whether services are still going to be viable, the entire supply chain has changed altogether. The manufacturing hub, that is China, is just one of the cogs that has changed.
Yes. Yes, no, that I think that is a very good point, and the emphasis on this, behavior change of the consumer, that is, I think, at the very core of not only the changes that we are witnessing, today, and the impact that we are witnessing today, but what will drive the transformation in the coming tomorrow. That all is going to depend on the consumer behavior. So as we notice the changes in consumer behavior today, especially, when we see that, online shopping, e-commerce is going to pick up significantly. But what else? What are the other trends we can identify? What are the other drivers we can identify from the consumer behavior today that will give us some sort of outlook where the world will be moving, not only for the supply chain, but also the business models and the new systems that would emerge. Where do you see us going because of this shift in the consumer behavior?
That's a great question. I don't necessarily see the shift just simply being, one day we were going to stores and buying products, and now we're buying the same products, we're just buying them online. There's a number of things that need to be considered. So if I look at some data sources, in certain data sources, I can see that the Department of Labor, USA Today, a number of different indicators, from CNN to Reuters to all these different metrics in terms of data measurement as far as unemployment numbers. You can see that there's a 14.7% unemployment claim that's taken place as it stands today. And if we compare that to the Great Depression, that was 24.9%, but if we compare it to the Great Recession in 2009, that was 9.9%. So we are at a significantly high rate of unemployment. Furthermore, changes in behavioral patterns have also been documented. Studies have also shown that fewer people obviously are able to shop for certain products. Fewer people are buying cars over the past 8 weeks. Fewer people are able to go into stores because stores have been closed. Fewer people are actually going to the grocery store, even if the grocery store is open, because they choose to buy it, whatever the product that they want is, and pick it up from the curb or have it delivered. So all of these different pieces are coming into effect. If we go a little bit further, we can also see that in the last 10 years, aside from the political connotations and spectrum, in the last 10 years there has been 21 million jobs added, and in the last in a little while, the number of jobs that have gone down have been tremendous. I mean, there's a number of factors that actually come into play to see how people's behavioral patterns are going to change. Now, while the model might be a little bit different, while the mode of purchasing might be a little bit skewed in terms of not being able to allow people to go into a store and buy something, the ability of people to purchase is also going to change. So what that means is that if we're looking at trend patterns, we can't necessarily say that there were sales of 5 million items over the period before the COVID-19 struck, and now there's going to be 5 million. It's just going to be online. It's not necessarily going to be the case. We have to adjust for how many people are still going to buy certain products, what's going to actually happen in certain industries. There's metrics that actually show the probability of default for certain industries. We can actually see, how certain areas, certain geographies have been impacted, how they've been devastated. If you look at Las Vegas, who's had to shut down the entire strip, cities like New Orleans, these types of places, there is a major hit that's taken place to the core infrastructure of how business functions. And if we look at the change in terms of consumer behavior, in terms of now going through more of a digital model and going online more, that's great, and that's expected, and that's exactly what we see. But we also have to factor in the possibility of industries that we relied on and business transitions or transactions that we relied on in the past having changed in themselves, not necessarily being just converted into a digital form, but perhaps changing in terms of the entire dynamic.
Yes, no, I agree with that. But I was thinking, as the consumer behavior changes, and more and more people start to purchase, even the basic items like groceries and all that, online. Ordering is one thing, but deliveries, are whole another thing. Now, so far, humans were, whenever we would order food from the restaurants to go, or, whenever we order groceries to be delivered, humans were delivering all that. The distribution was and delivery was always human was at the center. But if provided this COVID-19 pandemic, expands further, there are second phase, third phase, and it becomes more and more severe, and humans would be hesitant to go out of their house to protect themselves from these healthcare challenges that we all are facing at the moment. How do you see the businesses shifting their strategy for distribution, for deliveries? What kind of changes do you see happening for them to be able to survive these new, distribution model, new, delivery models, and what is required at the very core of that transformation for the businesses to be still operational?
It's a good question. In the example you gave, there's a number of different vulnerabilities that exist. Even if there is, a risk in terms of distribution and fulfillment, there's also, and if that can be lessened by various methods. I know now they have touch-free contact when you have food delivered, and they put it down instead of actually handing it to you, and these types of things, which is great. But I would argue that doesn't necessarily remove any or majority of the threats. That doesn't necessarily remove the majority of risk. There could still be a potential contamination at the site of where the food's actually made, potential contamination in terms of where the food's sourced or the ingredients are sourced, or these types of things. So there's a number of different factors that come into the fold. Businesses have so far, not all, but many, have focused, at least the consumer-facing businesses like restaurants, these sorts of, have largely focused, it seems, on the distribution portion, not necessarily the manufacturing portion as much. I mean, maybe monitoring staff and making sure that staff is okay before they actually make whatever it is they're making to distribute. But I haven't necessarily seen much attention placed on the actual ingredients that are put in the food and where that's sourced, and if there's risk factors of contamination of food. I don't even know if that's a consideration. But the point is that as things begin to go, if there is a second phase and a third phase and these types of things, simply restricting and optimizing the distribution side of the supply chain, it won't be enough. That is what's being done now. It might make for good marketing. It might prevent a portion of risk But I would not say that it's foolproof, and I would not say that it attends to the entire supply chain, perhaps just the last part.
Perhaps. Now, uh, we are likely going to see the acceleration in the digital transformation, and that there is no doubt about that. It seems, I mean, the digital age was already, we were moving towards that, but the speed at which we were moving is now, quite accelerated because of this COVID-19 pandemic. So as we are collectively forced to face all our weaknesses as individuals, as entities across nations, its government, industries, organizations, academia, everyone is going to face their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. We are at a point where we have to identify all our vulnerabilities. So once we do that, where do you see the needed transformation? What changes do you see are imminent that would fundamentally transform, or for, I would say, completely redesign and redefining of the supply chain for the coming tomorrow?
In terms of product manufacturing, in terms of distribution?
In terms of all the, pieces that, make the supply chain, production, distribution, everything.
Well, that's a good question. In a typical, supply chain model, you'd see a manufacturer, a distributor, maybe a wholesaler, and then a retailer, and then a consumer walking into a store and buying a product. That supply chain in itself is flawed. And that supply chain, that notion might be traditional, but it certainly doesn't apply and hasn't applied for many years. And the reason for why is because we have, online sales that exist. We have the ability for a wholesaler to act as a retailer. We have the ability for a consumer to go directly to the manufacturer in many ways. There's all sorts of different models that work, and all sorts of different businesses that use various types of models. As we move to a world that is more digitally inclined, more reliant on e-commerce and online purchasing, what we're essentially going to see is a movement to remove certain cogs of that supply chain. So, for example, retailers, physical retailers, had already been at risk. There was already the threat of online sales eroding certain portions of business from regular face-to-face and in-person brick-and-mortar retailers. That's just going to get accelerated, I would expect. It's not necessarily going to be a pivotal change in the supply chain. It's more so going to mean now there might be physical retailers, and I don't see them going away tomorrow because of the COVID-19 threat. But the reliance on those big box retailers, on those retailers in general, might be lessened, and it might be lessened to a greater effect than it would have been if COVID-19 hadn't taken place. The reason for why is because if you think about how things have progressed over the last 6 weeks, and you see that people who have never bought a product online before, never needed to go on Amazon, or never needed to, never even considered purchasing groceries online, had essentially had to be forced to do something in line with some sort of digital commerce. I mean, there were ways to go about it, but the vast majority had to adapt. And when we emerge and things go back to quote unquote normal and post COVID-19, at least post first phase COVID-19, and we see retailers opening up and grocery stores opening up, even if it's not in the same way, there'll still be demand. People will still inevitably go to these stores, but there might be a reduced number. It might not necessarily be a 50% reduction, but it might be a 10% or 15% or 20% reduction of people who are happy shopping online, who are now relying on Amazon, now relying on all these different online platforms, where in the past they had no need to even explore that as an option. So with that taking place, what we may see is that the supply chain in general, which was essentially flawed, it was more like a supply web or supply network, is now needing to contour to meeting the needs of those individual customers that are not going into those retailers at a much higher degree than perhaps before.
Yes, no, very true. Those are, many different dynamics that's shaping the entire supply chain. And I'm also thinking that whether the globalization of the supply chain will survive this, pandemic, because we had already, the digital age was already pushing us towards, more protectionism, more moving inwards. So it's going to be interesting to see whether we are going to continue seeing the global supply chain, or will the supply chains become more regional and more national. So what do you think? Do you think that globalization of the supply chain will survive, or we are going to see more and more of national and local and regional supply chain?
That's an excellent question. I'm inclined to believe that we will take a step back from being as globalized of a supply chain as we are in, but that's not necessarily a given. There's essentially two options that I can see. One is that we maintain our globalized supply chains as they stand to an extent as it stands today, and there are certain changes that are put in effect. There is more storage allocation in particular countries, a longer lead time, more of a willingness to have product produced in advance of when it's needed, so that if there is another event like this, product doesn't need to be imported from another country, it's in the country already. There is, in this scenario, we would have to go through, various production facilities, various manufacturers would have to go through maintaining production and maintaining the flow of commerce by adhering to an expected increase in security guidelines or health screenings and these types of things at various distribution points and at various different manufacturers. There might be governmental impacts that also need to be considered in terms of regulations as to where certain products can be produced, or what can be imported, or what the screening processes are for products coming in from specific countries into the United States or anywhere else. All of these different pieces will likely add two things. One would be time into the fold, so it'll take longer for a product to come, and the other will be cost into the fold. It'll be more costly for product to come. The alternative is more regional and smaller supply chains, which seem, at least in the interim, to be perhaps a little bit more likely. And this is where, even though it's a higher cost to manufacture products and a higher cost to store products, it might make more sense if we run a simulation and various types of modeling to reduce the risk of another pandemic taking place by having more regional supply chains. So having products produced in the country that they're being sold in, or manufactured and stored and warehoused and distributed from the country of production. Now, what this may mean is that we wouldn't be able to take advantage of low-cost materials. We might not be able to take advantage of low-cost labor. That may mean that the prices of these products actually go up. Okay? So there's a number of different factors that we have to consider, but globalization as a whole has become almost the catchword, almost the catchphrase in terms of supply chain. Right? Everything is globalized to an extent. There's products that are made in China, marketing arms that are done in the United States, distribution warehouses that are held throughout the world, warehouses for mixed products that are mixing centers that are used to avoid tariffs for finished products coming across the border. It's gone to an extent now where this is the norm. Is this getting too complex and too costly? And perhaps more so of a concern, is there too much risk that's added into the supply chain that, based on what we're seeing, would companies want to pivot to instead of being as globalized as they are, to being more local or more regional? Or would there be kind of a hybrid solution where there's still manufacturing that's taking place overseas, but there's also, for lack of a better word, safety stock in terms of the entire chain that's being produced and held in the country of operation.
Yes, no, I hear you there, but I'm also thinking that because we have gone through this pandemic and we are still going through this, and we are witnessing what challenges are emerging because of this globalized supply chain, that we are so vulnerable, we are so dependent on the other countries, even for basic materials like personally protective equipment and all. So we were not even able to get masks for this pandemic. So that probably will put the cost as the driving force for our decisions to send our manufacturing to other countries like China. So I do see that a lot of shifts will happen, because cost is not the sole driver here. It's our risk and it's our resiliency, the need for resiliency, that is going to drive the decisions for tomorrow. I think besides also because we are going more towards keeping cyberspace at the center, we will be collecting a lot more data of the consumer behavior, of where the risks are emerging, and where we can make our supply chain more intelligent. So what are the key elements from your perspective that are crucial for an intelligent supply chain and in a resilient supply chain that we need to build for the coming tomorrow?
Excellent. So these are some of the areas that I've consulted on and some of the areas in which I've worked in. Your point is extremely valid, where you're noting resilience as opposed to cost. But in many models, you can actually factor down the accepting of risk to a dollar figure. So you can actually price out what the cost is for a company accepting elements of risk. And it becomes a model in which we are basically deciding how much risk to take on, what proportionality of risk we want based on potential profits, based on potential profitability, based on potential cost, based on potential loss, based on potential revenue hits. So what we're essentially saying here is kind of the same thing. A company needs to, companies in general need to decide on how they want to minimize their level of exposure, their level of risk for, in the coming years, for potentially devastating scenarios like we're seeing now, and at what cost. If they are completely moving their manufacturing arms to different countries and localizing and onshoring, is that potentially going to price them out of the market? Is their product all of a sudden going to be needing to be priced at triple what their competitor's product is? And by way of various other simulations modeling, is that going to be something that consumers are wanting to pay? It depends on the product, depends on the industry, but there's a very good chance that the answer would be no. So by removing risk in terms of certain areas, you're actually potentially adding cost. And by accepting risk, you are theoretically adding cost if you model what the outcome would be if something were to take place. So in general, the point that I'm making is that in general, at the end of the day, when we look at it, it all comes down to cost. How much risk is taken, how much risk is avoided, where there's risk, how the business actually functions, what the cost of the product is that needs to go out to the consumer, all comes down to cost and the bottom line as far as whether or not a company can be viable by way of what risks they're taking.
Sure, I understand that, but at the same time, risk is a very broad term, and there are many, many different type of risk. And I think the cybersecurity risks are going to be at the center of the decision-making process, because as we move towards, defining and designing systems for the coming tomorrow, cyberspace is going to be at the center. Now, if we are going to purchase, procure cyberspace, cyber hardwares, or software from other countries with which we do not have good relations and with which we have known to be facing, cybersecurity attacks from them, that, countries, have to be very cautious where they get their digital supply chain, because digital supply chain is going to be at the center of a lot of decision-making processes. And there, I think not just for building the resiliency, managing the cyber security risk will be at the center of all the supply chain decision making process. So for instance, right now we have witnessed that for the 5G, United States is not going to be ever comfortable to get the 5G technologies from China, and the reason behind that we all know is about the algorithm that drives that. Same for the blockchain, or same for any other AI initiative that we may witness coming our way, the transformation that is based on artificial intelligence. So the countries like China, Russia, and others that we United States will always have concern getting their digital technologies from. So in this post COVID-19 world, as we try to see this, as we see digital technologies playing a critical enabling role in delivering the improvements, in redesigning systems, which technologies do you see are going to be at the center, and which countries are going to be at the center of this emerging geopolitics, and rightfully for the right reason, because it is, at the end of the day, it's all about security.
You're absolutely right. From a security standpoint, my expertise isn't necessarily in data security as much as it would be in the movement of products and supply chain management, but I can comment to your point in this way. As we move into a post-COVID world, what we're inevitably going to be seeing is a reliance on ways of doing business that have been different. That's most likely going to
I cannot hear you.
Zoom bombing, I think the term is, and all these different types of things that are coming into the place. Right? We can also look, and we can also see that if we look at the supply chain from an informational standpoint, we see where information is actually pulled from, where information is coming from, and how that data is arriving. Do we have measurement that can actually measure the flow of an operation? These types of things. Yeah, we do. Is it more so a matter of data sharing? That's possible, but I wouldn't necessarily say that has an impact in a physical supply chain, even a digital supply chain. It's more so the movement of information going one way, and the movement of product going the other way, as a general rule. And for the most part, what is taking place doesn't necessarily open more risks than there were before. Perhaps opens risks in a different way, because now we're looking at business from a different perspective, and we're focusing on digital transactions more so than we were physical transactions. But in general, the same risks will apply.
Yes. No, I see your point there. Now, as we collect all this data and we analyze the data of the digitization of the supply chain, what are the insights you are seeing? What can you share with our global viewers and listeners about what you are seeing that is troubling for the nations, individual nations, security, especially when we are going through times like COVID-19, and as we are witnessing the industries being impacted heavily, for instance agriculture and food industry, and the healthcare industry. What insights you are getting looking at the digitization of the supply chain?
Well, if you look at how things have changed in terms of even manufacturing cycles, you can see that there's a number of different areas that have actually taken place. I mean, we started off the conversation by talking about Chinese manufacturing. There's been a 13.5% decline in January and February 2020 versus January and February 2019. That's critical. We can also see that there's employee concerns in terms of food manufacturing too. Tyson Foods has come in the news lately because they've had some concerns in that arena. We're looking at drastic demand of forecasting vulnerabilities. We look at how many people are buying cars last year over this year. The forecasts and the projections are completely skewed. We don't necessarily know what's going on next. Hand sanitizer, the complete opposite. Right now, the sales for those have skyrocketed. So if we move from one arena to the next, what we're basically seeing is that we're having to do two things. At least two things. One is we're having to adjust to a different model of fulfilling the needs of consumers. The different model meaning online distribution and making sure that the product is received by an actual consumer. Now this opens the door to a number of different vulnerabilities. Is the product using last mile delivery services that are not necessarily able to distribute these products, not specialized distributors? Does that mean that there's a potential for damage? Does that mean that there's a potential for product misuse or risk or damage in terms of, injury? The way that the model is working now, and the way that we're kind of moving towards with e-commerce might also mean that there is strain put on certain other entities that weren't necessarily considered previously. If things are shut down and things are all of a sudden reopened and there's fewer employees that are going into a manufacturing plant, does that mean that those employees have more to do than they had to do before? Is the work of 10 employees now falling on the work of 5 employees from a manufacturing standpoint? Does that open the door for quality assurance issues, quality control issues? Right? Are there risks that are taking place there? And in addition to looking at that cycle and that piece and that part of the supply chain, which is drastically changed and is likely to continue to change, like we discussed, what we're also looking at that's kind of compounding this, the second part, is the economy as a whole and the uncertainty that's taken place, which has changed the willingness of people to spend. Right? So people are more conservative because it's an uncertain time, and they're more conservative possibly because of the unemployment numbers that have come up. And there's uncertainty because nobody really knows how the demand patterns are going to go and what to produce and what to make and where to store. So all of these different factors are coming in. And if we look at the transformation that's taking place from a supply chain, going digital, having more of a reliance on e-commerce, this is understandable. This is what we're seeing. But we're also seeing that the behavioral patterns are changing. So it might not necessarily be as many products that are purchased. And so from the manufacturing standpoint, manufacturers and the back end of the supply chain may not necessarily know how many to produce, how many to store, where to store. And if they are needing to completely regenerate their supply chain, what that may mean is that they might be trying to make these decisions while also contending with various other metrics for risk in terms of where they should be sourcing their product, where they should be manufacturing their product, where they should be distributing their product and wholesaling and storing their product. So all of these factors are coming into the mix basically all at once. Right? The supply chain in general has kind of stopped on a dime for what we were doing before COVID-19 and is now something that can't just be, if the trend was going like this, we can't just say, okay, well, we're flat now and we're going to go back to the same. That's not going to work. Everything has changed from the perspective of how people are buying, what's motivating purchases, how these products are being manufactured. Globally, products are being manufactured in general. There's considerations along the board, how products are being, or supplies are being procured, where they're being stored, how they're being shipped, what tariffs need to be considered, what restrictions need to be considered in the future, where there's potential political concerns or tax concerns or health concerns or screening processes that are going to elongate the supply chain or make the supply chain more costly, which isn't going to work for the end consumer. So a number of different considerations need to come up in general. Going through digital confirmation, the digital change, the digital adjustment is just kind of one. There's many others that are also taking place in the back end.
Very true. No, I see your point in that, and I was thinking it's not only the impact on the supply chain. We are also seeing the huge change in the demand side. And we are also seeing a huge change in the consumer behavior. Now, when we talk about the demand, if there is an outbreak of any, disease happening in any part of the world, there is going to be a fundamental shift in what would be required if it's going to become a pandemic. What kind of products will be necessary, and what kind of products supply will be necessary, and what kind of product demand will shoot up for the consumers to be able to get through any amount of time period that they have to get through because of this pandemic. Now, do we have any intelligence system that can tell nations, that can guide nations, that if this outbreak is happening in China or any part of the world, that what would be necessary, where would the demand increase, where would the supply need to be there, and what would need to change for us to be, for the global community or for any nation to be able to, individually get through, this turbulent time until, things settle down. Do we have any intelligence system that guides nations and its decision makers in how the supply and demand will shift during any and all outbreaks in the coming years?
Good question. One of the main problems is that we don't necessarily know, when this pandemic, I know this sounds rather ridiculous, we don't necessarily know when it's going to end. So it would be different if we knew that, we're in May at the moment. It would be different if we said, okay, by August 2020, this pandemic is going to be over. So we need to adjust our supply chain accordingly. And consumers and manufacturers and businesses knew that by August 2020, everything was going to go back to normal. Everything was going to be fine. That would be completely different. We don't know that. We have no idea what's going to happen next. There's concerns in terms of media posts that are troublesome in terms of second phases and third phases of the virus. And there's concern because of all sorts of other factors in terms of whether or not employment numbers are going to continue to plummet, how exactly stimulus packages are going to work, all sorts of different areas that are behind the scenes that are may not appear to be a supply chain issue, but actually are, because they're impacting the way people actually think and the behavioral patterns of consumers. Now, what that means is that we don't necessarily have a model that says, okay, well, if this happens, then we do this, and this is what the impact is going to be, and that's the end of it. The reason for why is because we don't know how behavioral patterns of consumers are going to change. It's going to be long term. It's going to be short term. We have cues and we have metrics, and we can kind of see from prior data how things may have changed. And previous times of uncertainty after 9/11, the global financial crisis, the Thailand, all the ones that I mentioned earlier, we can see how people's behavioral patterns changed and how long it's taken to kind of come back in terms of spending, in terms of spending in certain areas like airlines and these types of things. But is there a way that we can conclusively tell what is going to happen based on if this pandemic were to last for 2 months, 3 months? No, there isn't. Based on everything that's changing, we are not necessarily able to say, okay, we have a pandemic, this is how it's going to affect the automotive industry to the actual percentage. There's so many factors that are contributing, like we mentioned earlier, in terms of behavioral patterns, industry, manufacturing sites, delivery models, all of these different things. There's so many pieces of the puzzle that it's not necessarily clear to see, what the impact is going to be and how the impact might be if another pandemic took place or another disaster took place. We can look at previous data and we can see how people reacted and how businesses reacted and how businesses changed and how people changed, consumers changed, and what the ways of overcoming prior disasters were. And we can make assumptions and use some sort of trend analysis and perhaps regression in some ways, but that's about it. But if we have that taking place, we might be only preparing for the same event. In other words, another pandemic, right? Another flood, another earthquake, which is very important. But what about the next supply chain disaster that is different than what we're seeing now, right? If you know what I mean. So when 9/11 took place, for example, there was preparedness in terms of security measures and whatnot for future situations that would have happened, similar to that, and perhaps a little bit of a spectrum, so a little bit of the other areas that may have been similar. When the floods took place in Thailand, or the earthquakes in Japan, and these types of things, hurricanes, even in the United States, that infected a lot of the supply chain areas of various companies. We can kind of say, okay, well, this is our plan for next time this happens. This is what we're going to do because we learned from this time. But how do we go down the path of projecting what to do in the next supply chain disaster as a whole? That becomes difficult. We might be able to learn from what we've done this time and say, okay, well, the next time a pandemic happens, this is what is going to be impacted, but not necessarily as a whole a supply chain disaster.
Yes, absolutely. I think we learn from this experience, and then we have the data and the information that we have been collecting during this pandemic, and then use that knowledge and build intelligent systems for the coming tomorrow that would help us to get through any and all future crises that can come our way. So having said that, it seems you have written a great book on supply chain management. So what would you like to tell our global viewers and listeners about your book, and about where you, if any of them would like to purchase the book, where they should be looking for? Would it be on Amazon, or where would that be available? And especially, what would you like to tell our young brilliant minds that are trying to shape the coming tomorrow, are trying to redesign the systems, and want to make sure that they bring security and resiliency and trust in our systems? What would you like to tell them also?
Well, thank you. Let me answer the first question for you. The book that I've written is called Perspectives of Supply Chain Competitiveness. The subtitle is An Evaluation of Supply Chain Growth, Literature, and the Framework for Assessment and Vulnerabilities in Gaining a Competitive Advantage. Essentially, the book is interesting in that it discusses various arenas for how the literature of supply chain management has existed, where the growth of supply chain management has focused to be competitive in nature, and finally, where there are vulnerabilities in the growth of competitiveness within supply chain management. In other words, if companies were to use the supply chain to gain a competitive advantage, where they might have specific vulnerabilities. The book will be available on Amazon. It's just gone into print now, so we're on the 21st of May. It's just gone into print as of yesterday. So I expect it should be available on Amazon in mid-June 2020 for purchase. As far as advice to the young professionals that are coming into the world of supply chain management, I would basically share some advice that I was given that has worked, for me, in looking at supply chain management as a practice and as a concept. It's easy to accept supply chain management as a stable and functioning theory. The problem is that it's the exact opposite of that. It's changing every day, every event that takes place, everything changes. Supply chain management is not necessarily a concept. It's more of a description of a concert of events that are constantly changing and taking place and interacting with one another. My advice is to focus on not necessarily what has happened only in terms of data, but what might be happening from a number of different perspectives. Consumer behavioral patterns, political changes, growth of communities, growth of countries, changes in terms of competition, not necessarily just a product and looking at demand forecasts and looking at the same type of data that we are kind of accustomed to look at. In this respect, you are not necessarily just understanding supply chain as a concept, but you're understanding it as a part and perhaps foundation of a business as a whole.
Yes, very true. That's an excellent advice. So thank you so much, Dr. Phiroz, for participating in Risk Roundup today. We appreciate your thoughtful insight on impact of COVID-19 on global supply chain, and I'm sure our global viewers and listeners will benefit tremendously from the information you provided today, and especially the young people. I'm sure that they will get inspiration from the discussion that we had today, and as a result, this Risk Roundup dialogue has been of service. We thank you for that. So Risk Group is a strategic security risk research platform and community, and our ecosystem is the first and only cross-disciplinary and collective community that is made of top scientists, security professionals, thought leaders, entrepreneurs, philanthropists, policymakers, and academic institutions from across nations collaborating to research, review, rate, and report strategic security risks to protect the future of humanity. Add your voice to risk groups, get involved to protect the future of humanity. Until next time, I'm Jayashree, host of Risk Roundup, signing off. See you next time. Thank you.